It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, by George, I think he's got it. Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. Well, today we're going to talk about something that's all important. If you follow my podcast, particularly if you watch the shows with Dr. Stephen W. Schmidt, and he talks about the power around, for the world, really, but certainly in this country, it's vested in the economy. It's the economy, stupid. It has to do with who gets elected and who doesn't. And of course, this next one's a big one. Anybody will tell you that for 2024 and what's coming up. And it has to do with what a lot of people are calling Bidenomics. I mean, is this economic plan working? And if not, why not? And there's some blame, there's some fault on both sides of the line, Republican and Democrat. We're going to get into that today. I hope you saw the promo here. Let me bring this up on screen because this kind of sums it up. The U.S. poverty rate has spiked. Now, there's a reason for it that you may not be aware of. And child poverty has doubled in the past year. Yeah, that's what this report says. And we're going to talk to our expert here, a fellow that's coming back on the podcast by George Live Line. And you've seen him on here before. And here he is. It is Dr. Peter F. Orazem. He's an Iowa State University professor, newly retired. His expertise is human resources economics, labor economics, economic development, innovation, technological change and growth, and urban, rural, regional, real estate, and transportation economics. His education, get this, a PhD from Yale University in 1983, an MPhil from Yale University, 1980, a BA at the University of Kansas way back in 1977, the same year that I graduated from college. And I said, no mas, no mas. And apparently he said, I'm just getting started, and away he went. And now, as I mentioned, he's newly retired as a professor, but he serves as the director of the program for the study of Midwest markets and entrepreneurship. We're going to talk about this poverty reporting, and we're going to basically very briefly talk about the UAW strike too, I hope. Anyway, let me take that off the screen, click a couple of buttons here, and let's see that one there and this one here, and say good morning to Dr. Orazem. Hi, Doc.
Good morning.
Hey, thanks for coming on the podcast by George Live Line to talk about economics. Man, I need you because I remember back, I was talking about getting my BA. Economics was not one of my stellar courses. I didn't do real well in it. I don't know why. I think I understand some of it now, but I didn't back then. And I need some clarification today on this news that we're seeing reported. Let me bring this up on screen. This is from the USA Today. Now, a lot of people have seen this because it's in the USA Today. It reads, the streak is now broken. U.S. poverty rate over time shows a spike in 2022 levels. The number of Americans living in poverty has gone up for the first time in years, the U.S. Census Bureau announced Tuesday. Experts caution the trend, including an increasing child poverty rate. I mean, it's exploding, according to what I'm seeing. Could get worse if government officials and politicians fail to fill in families' financial gaps with adequate social safety net programs. Newly released data shows in 2022, 12.4% of Americans lived in poverty, up from 7.8% in 2021. Now, Doc, the other thing, I'm not a mathematician, but if you 12.4% against 300 million Americans living in poverty, I mean, I have a hard time believing that. Do you believe it?
Well, I think there are a couple issues. We have many different measures of poverty. The official poverty rate, which is the original poverty rate that was developed under the guidance of Molly Orshansky back in the early 1960s. There was no change in poverty using that particular measure. There is a supplemental poverty rate measure, which incorporates better government transfer programs, both in-kind transfer programs and tax policies. And that is the one that increased primarily because of the shutting down of some of the transfer programs that were put in place during the early years of the pandemic.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that. And that's kind of where the The fingers are being pointed on this thing, as the doc mentions. Let me bring this back up on screen here. I think we can get it by clicking this to where I can read it, bring it up full screen here. Okay, so that has to do with these figures. 12.5% of 300 million. That's like, I don't know, 36, 40 million people, something like that, living in poverty, up from 7.8% in just 2021, the Bureau said, representing millions more living without the minimum level of resources to meet their basic needs. Of course, that's a definition also. The increase in 2022 was likely connected to the end of the pandemic era benefits, as the doc mentioned. That's according to Dave Waddington, cited chief for the Census Bureau's Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division. He said that back on Tuesday of last week. Notably, the poverty rate for children in 2022 more than doubled from 2021. What? That's according to Leanna Fox, the Census Bureau's Assistant Director Chief for Economic Characteristics, Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics. The loss of the expanded child tax credit was a big factor that led to a significant increase in child poverty. Fox said, okay, Doc, there was a lot of warning about this child tax credit, but I think it went right over people's heads because it was a child tax credit. But explain what that was and why the lack of it has resulted in such a spike in child poverty.
Well, the child tax credit existed before the pandemic. There were two things that were done during the pandemic that made the child tax credit more generous. One was that they expanded the amount per child, and so it immediately becomes more generous for that purpose. But the other is that they made it fully refundable, which means that under the previous and now current rules, if you don't pay income tax, then you can't get the child tax credit. It's a credit against the income tax that you owe. And if you owe $2,000 of income tax and your child tax credit is $4,000, well, you can only deduct up to the $2,000, right? You can't go into a negative income tax situation. But when they made the child tax credit fully refundable in 2021, 2022, then that greatly expanded the number of people who could qualify, including people who were not working.
Words mean everything. I talk about that on my show because, I'm a journalism major. That's what my background and training was in. The child tax credit. Do you think a lot of people perhaps didn't know what the government was doing for them, didn't recognize the benefit that they were getting? Whereas if you had just given the money to them directly in the form of a check, as has been done during the COVID relief, they would understand it better, and the situation would be a little different today. Or is that not true, do you think?
Well, but all those things were happening at the same time, right? So you had the 1,600 or whatever it was that
Yes.
almost everybody got, and then you have some that you can qualify for if you have children under the age of 17. We also have a child and dependency credit, which is sort of in the mix, which helps give you tax credits if you're paying for childcare, right? But all of these things, including expansion of food stamps and the expansion of the unemployment insurance amount that you could qualify for, and making it easier to qualify for unemployment benefits, all of those things sort of came online in 2021, and some of them ended up being cut back by the end of 2021. Others were reduced and then ultimately eliminated in 2022. But I think what happens is if you give somebody money, they adjust their plans in terms of consumption based on that. If you take it away, then suddenly that becomes much more of an issue. So there are studies in psychology that say that you place greater value in what you have in hand versus how much you would be willing to pay for that. Well, when you have this massive increase in transfer payments here in Iowa, for example, There was a huge increase in per capita incomes in 2021 during the pandemic. It turned out that over 90% of the increase was due to transfer payments. Well, if you get rid of that, that's a lot of income that's going away.
Yeah, factor that in there, folks. I mean, and of course, that was because of the pandemic. Let me see what else is in here. Notably, the poverty rate for children in 2022 more than doubled from 2021. Okay, we mentioned that. The loss of the expanded child tax credit was a big factor that led to a significant increase in child poverty. Yes. Now, what is the poverty level income? In 2023, a family of four is living in poverty if they make less than $29,950 annually, the Census Bureau said Tuesday. This has a lot to do with everything. It's the definition of poverty. For a single person, the number is 14,880, according to the Bureau's official poverty measure. And I've got this chart here that folks might be able to see if they squint or look closely enough. The chart shows the 2023 federal poverty level at the different income rates here. So I don't know. I was kind of surprised to see this, but critics of this will say this is really what it's all about. It's where, I mean, these headlines sound great, but it's all about the levels, Doc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what you have is that the poverty rate increases with the number of people in your household, right? So that's what you've got there. Now, one of the things, and this is a criticism that holds generally for poverty rates estimated in the U.S. The U.S. does it differently than other countries. But one of them is that it doesn't take into account the cost of living in your local area. So $30,000 is going to go a lot farther, for example,
Yes.
in rural Iowa than it will in New York City. And yet the same income threshold applies to both places. So the presumption is that if you were able to control for the local cost of living, you would have a much more accurate portrayal of what's happening to the poverty rate.
Yeah, and I showed that there, that $35,000 figure for a family of five. That's a husband and wife and three kids. I mean, if you make $35,000 a year, you're living in poverty federally. It doesn't matter if you're in South Dakota, like the doc says, or if you're in New York City. I mean, that's one of the problems with these statistics. Let me bring this up on.
Well, let me give you another one if you want
Yeah,
to know. I'm here in Ames, Iowa, and you might
yeah.
be surprised to find out that the poverty rate in Ames, Iowa is 28%. Well, if you take out 18 to 24-year-olds, the poverty
Yes.
rate is 6 or 7%. So all these college students are considered poor, well, because they don't have much income, but it doesn't really reflect the assets that they have available to them. And so there are a lot of issues in terms of taking the poverty statistics and then applying them in practice. So most of the neighborhoods in Ames will qualify for federal poverty alleviation programs because there's a large enough population of students in that neighborhood to bring up the poverty rate, even though, I would argue that Ames is relatively well off.
Yeah, and I don't know. You mentioned how the Europe and other places that analyze this differently. There's probably no perfection with this. There's got to be a certain amount of art involved in the science of this. Is there another format that you prefer, or are we pretty much stuck with what we got here?
Well, I think that the supplemental poverty measure that is the one that increased substantially is closer to what you want because it reflects the consumption of goods and services and not income. And so a lot of the federal programs, for example, what we used to call food stamps, now the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, doesn't qualify as income, but yet it's our largest poverty alleviation effort on the part of the federal government. So if you increase the SNAP benefits, the food stamp benefits, it does nothing to the official poverty rate, because we don't incorporate those in-kind benefits in the form of increased access to food in your in the poverty measure. And so one of the things that the supplemental measure that they've now started reporting more generally, and that's the one that you're referring to that went up so much for children. the reason it went up is we cut off some of those benefits, right?
Yeah.
The food stamps are less generous, and we've cut back on some of the tax credits. Whereas the official poverty rate, which doesn't include those things at all, didn't change at all. Now, just for your listeners, the current measure for children is 12.4% under the supplemental measure. That's pretty much back to where it was before the pandemic. And so what we've done is we've disabled some of the pandemic transfer programs, and we've returned back to the level of poverty that we had before we got into the coronavirus.
But supporters would say that's a perfect reason to continue them. I mean, that it works. And where do you come down on this, like SNAP benefits and the food stamps? That's where, I mean, the conversation always seems to go. There are people that just hate that, but there are other people that look at it and say it's the best way to goose the economy. It's the best way to support agriculture. It's the best way to help people, particularly hungry children. It's all good. As an economist, how do you view it?
Well, I think it's a fairly effective way of trying to get resources to households. We could argue whether or not giving dollars directly versus giving them food is the more effective means, because in some places food prices are higher, and in other places food prices are lower. And so if you give people dollars directly, they can adjust their consumption based on what is the best use of those dollars. But at the end of the day, I think everybody would argue that what you really want is for benefits to go to the people who are in need. And so the most effective of the anti-poverty programs, at least for the working poor, is the earned income tax credit, which has very high rate of getting the benefits to the people who actually need the benefits. So there are people who qualify for food stamps who have wealth, but they don't have income, and you could argue that isn't efficiently targeted. On the other hand, the food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program does reasonably well at getting benefits to people who need them. And so I think there's general consensus that it's a reasonably good program.
All right, folks, we're talking to Dr. Peter F. Orazem. He's an economist. We're going to talk about politics here a little bit because they are intertwined, and it gets to the finger pointing part of this. I got to get this up on screen large enough for me to see it, folks. Let's see if that helps. Yeah, that helps. The U.S. child poverty rate more than doubled in 2022, thanks to Manchin and the GOP. Now, this is from Common Dreams. I reference them frequently on my show. Joe Manchin's legacy includes artificially manufacturing child poverty for no reason other than his callous disregard for human beings, said the Debt Collective, following the release of new census data that we're talking about here. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin and congressional Republicans faced a fresh backlash on Tuesday after the U.S. Census Bureau released new data showing that the nation's child poverty rate more than doubled in 2022 compared to the previous year, thanks in large part due to the expiration of the boosted child tax credit. Now, that's what we've been talking about. The expanded CTC and American Rescue Plan policy that sent eligible families up to $300 per month for each child and eliminated the original CTC's regressive phase-in helped push the U.S. child poverty rate to a record low of 5.2% in 2021. Now, it's gone back up because it was rescinded, but the program expired at the end of that year after Manchin, who supported the ARP, opposed an extension. And this guy, he's that lone wolf vote in the Democratic Party that a lot of people say has more power than the president, who gets overruled by a parliamentarian. But this Manchin guy, baselessly claiming that some parents would use the money on drugs instead of their children. Survey data showed that most families, including those in West Virginia, where he's from, use the money to buy food and help with rent, along with other essentials. Again, looking at this as an economist, Doc, and you mentioned this briefly, is that your understanding that these benefits are by and large vastly used for appropriate things as opposed to drugs, sex, and rock and roll or something. I don't know what people think that they're using their food stamps or SNAP benefits for, but that's what Manchin said.
Well, I don't want to speak for Joe Manchin. He's one of 100 senators, so it's sort of hard to say that he has the power over the other 99. His concern with the refundable part of the child tax credit was he thought it was too expensive, and so it ought to limit to the amount of tax liability that you have. And what that does, of course, is it means that the benefit goes more to the working poor than the non-working poor. I don't have any problem with that. It depends on what the goal is. So as I mentioned, the earned income tax credit also goes disproportionately to the working poor, but you only get it if you're working. So those issues as to whether or not the government ought to sort of aim its policies toward the working poor or the poor more generally is one that I find it hard to say that there's a right or a wrong on those things. The SNAP benefits, of course, go to individuals whether they're working or not. So we do have programs, including housing subsidies, that are targeted to income earned, and you qualify whether you're working or not. And so, I don't know the particular group that you're dealing with here, but I'd say that isn't exactly a even-handed analysis of what the actual debate was. Joe Manchin wanted to throw people out under a bus. Maybe, but I suspect not.
Let's see here. Continue with this. This is from Common Dreams. And Common Dreams there's no doubt about it. And the doc understands that too. It's a left-wing perspective. Now, it says, according to the Social Policy Institute at Washington University in St. Louis, among Manchin's constituents in West Virginia who received the CTC, more than half used the payments to buy groceries. 39% said some of the payments went to buying clothing. 38% said they used them to pay essential bills, and more than a quarter reported using the CTC to help with rent or mortgage payments. Now, this is self-reporting, so maybe the drug addicts that Manchin was referring to, whatever few of them maybe they said.
Yeah, I imagine there weren't a lot of people reporting that
they used them for drugs. Yeah,
for drugs and alcohol, right? So.
Now, the Social Policy Institute, which surveyed people in every state last summer regarding their use of the CTC, found similar results in other states, with about half of recipients nationwide reporting that they mainly used the payments to buy food. Rather than a genuine concern for families' ability to make sound financial decisions, New York Times columnist Janelle Bowie tweeted Monday, the senator appears motivated by a moral opposition to dependency, defined as low-income people getting anything that they don't directly work for with wage labor. And I highlighted that because Manchin, he's from West Virginia. That's coal mining country. I mean, that's ingrained in the fabric of that state. But that really is the argument that you hear a lot. They don't want to give people anything. They want people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but they don't recognize or want to talk about the social welfare that the wealthy get and that the military gets and that Wall Street gets and that everybody else gets. They want to drill down and take extreme exception to this amount of money that goes to the working poor of the country. Now, that's some political stuff from me, but it is my podcast. So
yeah,
that's what I like to say about that.
Welcome very much. One of the things that you haven't mentioned is inflation, and food prices have risen more rapidly than inflation overall. The other element of inflation that has risen more rapidly overall is energy. And those things are extremely volatile, but they do respond to the level of transfer payments that generally went into the economy, in part related to not working, right? So we weren't producing stuff during the early months of the pandemic. and yet we had more dollars floated there, and as a consequence, you had upward pressure on prices, particularly for necessities. And so, as a consequence, I think that one of the other reasons why you have an increase in insecurity, particularly food insecurity, is related to rising prices of food.
And this self-reporting thing and the way that you feel and the way you sense your security or insecurity has a lot to do with this. Like I said, when I saw the headlines and the basic statistics on this, to me, it was just jaw-dropping. And this was too. Now, this is from SheerPost that I follow very closely. They say, furthermore, while it is true that according to the official poverty rate, which doesn't account for factors such as geographic variation and housing expenses, which Dr. Orazem talked about, when calculating poverty thresholds, federal and state taxes, work expenses, nor medical expenses, 2022 marked the lowest poverty rate on record at 17.1% for Black Americans. Polls among Black Americans tell a different story about the financial hardship the community faces. So you've got the statistic, a record low of 17.1% for Black Americans. But if you poll them, in August 2022, about 55% of Black Americans reported in that poll from NPR that they were experiencing serious financial difficulties. Okay. And so, and there it is, highlighting his mind, 55%. So what do you make of that, Doc, the official reporting versus the polling?
Well, once again, I think you have issues with perceptions versus reality, and perceptions, I think, are extremely important, right? So I think a lot of commentators have pointed to sort of general concerns about President Biden's fiscal policies, even though arguably the unemployment rate is as low as it could possibly go. And, we have had many months of successive increases in total employment. And yet, I think the perceptions are driven by rising prices and an assessment that the cost of living is, we had 35 years of 2% or so inflation, and suddenly we popped up to 5, 6, 7%. And I think those perceptions reflect the fact that you go to the grocery store every week and you go, well, I wasn't paying this, last year. And so some of the issues in terms of the perception of the economy from African American populations is they're also disproportionately living in cities where the costs, particularly housing costs, as well as food costs, have risen atypically greatly. And then about half live in the South. The South has tended to do better in response to the pandemic economically than the North and the industrial states, but still you have some differences related to geography, and of course poverty programs aren't adjusted for costs of living.
Why would the South do better? Energy? Well, what would be the explanation for that?
Well, the South has been growing more rapidly. There are various explanations for why the South has done better. Some is catch up, right? So they were behind for many years, and so you have some equalization. Business expansion and economic growth has tended to be more rapid in the South. If you look at the response of state economies to the pandemic, I think Idaho, Utah, Texas, Florida are the ones with the most rapid increase in employment in response to the pandemic. The worst performing economy, oddly enough, is the District of Columbia. And that's related to the fact that the federal government allowed everybody to work from remotely. And a lot of the district was based on catering to the needs of people who were commuting into the district on a daily basis. And so the District of Columbia, particularly their hospitality industry, restaurants, bars, but also convention business, has been devastated by the pandemic and the federal government shutdown of face-to-face or in office work.
Yeah, and the thing that rings a bell with me, I've heard that the people just outside the district now, to the north and northwest, the affluent suburbs up there, they're booming because a lot of that is defense industry stuff. But that's a discussion for another day. Let me bring this up on screen here. This is another big thing with perception and the general vibe in America. And I talk about this a lot on my show, and I differ from a lot of my viewers. The stock market is hugely significant, and people will say, well, yeah, well, that's just for rich people that own stocks. I said, no, this is for people that work down at the local grocery store that we were talking about. They've got 401ks. They've got stocks. I mean, that's what the 401k is vested in. And so they see it going up. They see their retirement opportunities perhaps improving, and they feel better about the economy and perhaps an incumbent that's in office. This is the line, the arrow there is mine, but this is the S&P 500. Now, this is a broad measure of the market as opposed to the Dow, which is only up, 4 or 5% this year, but it has zoomed. The stock market has. And Doc, I go all the way back to Barack Obama coming out of the financial collapse, the financial industry collapse. I was a big advocate for him to do something to shore this up, to shore up the futures of, millions, tens of millions, hell, of Americans, because they've got these 401ks that are in the stock market. And I don't think people look at this or understand this well enough.
Well, the stock market skyrocketed in 2020 and 2021. In fact, I think one of the reasons why you had this surge in retirements during the pandemic was people who saw that their 401k rose, perhaps 40% or so in value. And they said, well, okay, I think I can play out the string. Now, they didn't plan on having the reduction in the stock market of not quite 20% in 2022, but I mean, a fair amount of retrenchment of stock prices. And so, yeah, the market has rebounded somewhat this year, but it's still not back at its peak at the end of 2021. And so, I don't know that, if you're in the stock market for the long run, you welcome years like 2020 and 2021, and you regret years like 2022. But I can't remember what the starting point was for your stock market graph, but we're still not back at the peak. So.
Let me see here if I can bring it back up on screen there. You can see it just, no, that's kind of small with us kind of big.
Yeah, if you look at where
that's
we were
at
the beginning of the year, I think we're pretty much flat but it certainly is. The last few months have been more favorable than, let's say, the previous period in 2022.
I've had you on before, and I've wanted to ask you, and I've never gotten to it. And if we could do a podcast just on this, but I have seen, and I think it was reporting on public television, actually, a documentary on the 401k, and the outtake from that basically was it's been a failure. It's not a great retirement program. It hasn't delivered for the majority of Americans the type of retirement planning that they need. What's your feel about the 401k, and is there any alternative at this juncture?
Well, I'm happy with mine. I think it's interesting when you look at, there was a book that was published a long time ago called The Millionaire Next Door. And the basic story was most of the millionaires in the United States are boring. They put money aside on a steady basis and they worked, and generally you would have two people in the household working, so you had two incomes and not just one. And um, and you get to 65 and suddenly you find out that, oh my God, we have all these assets. So I mean, one of the keys to being a millionaire was to live to be 65 and work and put money aside on a regular basis. And the 401k, I think, makes that quite efficient. I don't know what research you can argue that a defined benefit plan is less risky, right? Because you're not subject to the whims of the stock market. But
I think
a long time ago, Warren Buffett was quoted as saying that no one ever went broke betting on the U.S. economy, and that's what your 401k does, right? It's a diversified way of betting on the U.S. economy, and I think if you do it regularly, you've done pretty well. I mean, the average return on stock market 7.5%, 8% per year over a long period of time. Those percentage returns with regular dollar cost averaging. So you put money in. You don't know if the stock market is high or low, but it turns out you buy more shares when the stock market is low after the fact, and you buy fewer shares when the stock market is high, and you benefit from that.
Yeah, dollar cost averaging. I think what the documentary was talking about was the difference between a corporation paid pension plan as opposed to the 401k. And I think what they were talking about also was the fact that a lot of people can't afford, or they don't have access to a 401k. They don't have any money to put in it. They're barely buying food like we're talking about, particularly when they're younger. But to the doctor's point, if you just put a few bucks in there, I mean, just get it started. You don't have to have it overflowing when you begin, and it will grow, compound accordingly. And when you reach retirement age, it is a good program. But is it accessible? Is it available? Do the majority of Americans have enough money to put into it? And then the self-administration part of it is an issue also, because people have a tendency to rob themselves basically and take from their own plans and 401ks. And if I recall correctly, that was that documentary. But I don't want to talk about that too much here.
Well,
did you have something else you wanted to add?
If I wanted to make a very quick pitch for a future program is, I mean, the biggest defined benefit plans are state and local pensions, right? And underfunding of state and local pensions is legal. It's not legal for private firms. And so the underfunding of state and local pensions runs to the trillions of dollars right now. And at some point, someone's going to have to pay for that.
Yes, and he looks into the camera at us, folks. Okay, let me bring this. We're running out of time here. Yeah. Quickly, I want to get there. This is a guy that I really like. I have him on my show a lot, Stephen Semler, on his Speaking Security website. He says the food insecure population grows for the fifth straight month. And he's a great chart guy. He shows this going on in 2022. The starting point here, the low spot going up to 2023 for the food insecurity. And then I wanted to bring this up on screen also. That's the federal. Oh, that's not the one that I want. That's the federal poverty levels. We already did that one. Okay, let me bring this, because this is something that I bitch about all the time. Okay, so, we're talking about, the government withdrawing the child tax credit, and we talked about Joe Manchin and all that type of thing. Well, what about the Pentagon, folks? It failed its fifth audit in a row. Now, this is from a while back. This is from last year. If the Defense Department can't get its books straight, how can it be trusted with a budget of more than $800 billion per year? And it's more than that. If you all things considered, it's getting close to $1 trillion a year. It says last week the Department of Defense revealed that it had failed its fifth consecutive audit. I would not say that we flunked, said DOT Comptroller Mike McCord. That's what he would say, although his office did note that the Pentagon only managed to account for 39% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. Yeah, 39% was all it could account for $3.5 trillion in assets. The process is important for us to do, and it's making us get better. It's not making us get better as fast as we would like. I mean, it's almost laugh out loud stuff. The news came as no surprise to Pentagon watchers. After all, the U.S. military has the distinction of being the only U.S. government agency to have never passed a comprehensive audit. Now, they've never passed one. They've got all kinds of money, trillions of dollars that they can't account for. Now, this comes from the Department of Oversight. The Committee on Oversight and Accountability is investigating the Department of Defense's DoD failure to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. In November 2022, which is what we were talking about, they failed that fifth audit. The U.S. Government Accountability Office also recently reported the DOT continues to fail to accurately account for hundreds of billions of dollars of government-furnished property in the hands of contractors, wrote both Republican lawmakers, and the Republicans are saying this. DOD's inability to adequately track assets risks our military readiness and represents a flagrant disregard for taxpayer funds, even if it receives nearly $1 trillion annually. Think of that, $1 trillion annually renewable. Doc, could you think of a better use for that when it comes to the domestic economy, when it comes to the things that we're talking about? Should some of that military money be reallocated to help folks and stimulate the economy domestically?
Well, the federal government has had a little bit of trouble with their budgeting and accounting in other areas as well. So I don't want to single out the military. I remember Radar O'Reilly was mailing home a Jeep one part at a time back to Iowa. Now that was fictional, but I suspect there was a fair amount of realism behind that. Obviously, I mean, the federal government needs to take the resources it gets from the taxpayer seriously, and it's always disconcerting when you find out that the budgeting or the accounting is faulty. But you had the same issue with transfer payments during the pandemic, right? So they're now up to about 160 billion of fraudulent unemployment benefits. I think that there's a lot of embarrassment to go around in terms of proper accounting of monies over the last few years.
Yeah, I think with the military, it has to do with just the simple scale. My God, $1 trillion annually renewable in that budget. Doc, I tell everybody that from where you and I are sitting right now, that's a stack of $1,000 bills. It's 67 miles. It's over the distance that you and I are speaking right now. That's the amount of money the U.S. military gets each year, and they can't account for trillions of dollars. And it's just the scale of the thing. Okay, now we're going to run out of time with because when we start talking about economics and politics, I mean, you're talking about everything. As I mentioned at the onset, Dr. Orazem is a national authority on economics and on these labor situations. I wanted to get his kind of opinion of what's going on here. Is this a tempest in a teapot, or is this something that's going to brew and boil over? The UAW justifies wage demands by pointing to CEO pay raises. So just how high were they? This was in the news a lot just over the past weekend. It's been a central argument for the United Auto Workers Union. If Detroit's 3 auto workers raised CEO pay 40% over the past 4 years, workers should get similar raises. The UAW president, Sean Fain, has repeatedly cited the figure, contrasting it with the 6% pay raises auto workers have received since their last contract in 2019. He opened negotiations with a demand for a similar 40% wage increase over 4 years, along with the return of pensions and the cost of living increases. The UAW since lowered its demand to 36% wage increase, but the two sides remain far apart in contract talks, triggering a strike. Now, that's, where these things always start. They start far apart. This gets into the CEO's incomes, and that one CEO that was GM that was interviewed, I believe she said, or that she made $29 million last year. But again, and it goes back to what we were talking about with the stock market, and it has to do with shareholders of these major corporations and the disconnect in America between CEOs who serve at the behest and the reward of shareholders, as opposed to working for or being even the boss, I think, in a lot of respects for actual workers, and this ratio of incomes that has been all in the news the past week or so. What say ye, Doc?
Well, one reason why CEOs have really good years is because their company made profits, and their compensation is tied to changes in their stock market. So you have stock options, and if the company is doing well, you get rewarded for that. If the company does badly, you don't get rewarded for that. And so they're not going to make 29 million every year. But and I don't think the UAW wants to be paid on the share of profits for the U.S. automobile industry. In fact, they may be a little bit concerned about the future of the U.S. automobile industry going forward. So at the end of the day, what you say during a strike, this should be a good time to have a strike, right? We still don't have enough cars on the dealer lots. Prices of cars have risen during the pandemic, and I know that because the used car I just bought is the most expensive car I've ever bought by a substantial fraction. But so the things that get said during the course of the negotiations generally aren't the most pleasant things that would be said on a day-to-day basis. I suspect that at the end of the day, that you're going to ask for a big contract. The big one is going to be, are they going to tie things to inflation? We didn't have to do that when we didn't have inflation, right? And so, but the most recent John Deere contract reinstituted inflation adjustments. I think they were UAW also, and I suspect they're going to have a similar type of contract looking at the automobile firms, Ford, GM, and whatever Chrysler is called now.
Yeah.
But I think there are other issues. The transfer to electric vehicles is going to use fewer workers. It's likely that a lot of production is going to be shifting to the south, potentially non-union plant, and I think those are going to be a lot trickier, and I'm sure that's going to be part of the discussion as well.
Again, talking about the left, and I'm part of this little patchwork quilt of left-wing media that doesn't get platformed in a lot of places. People on the left are looking at this UAW thing, and they're like, let's roll. Let's go. They want a general strike. They want a major monkey wrench in the works here to get some major changes in the country from a left-wing perspective. Now, I remember when you and I talked last, we were in the midst of that deer strike here in the heartland, and that got resolved, and things are moving along such as they are, and it's almost been forgotten, shuffled off to the dustbin of history. But what about this one? Does this have the potential, do you think, to be something more, or do you expect this? I mean, I know you can't tell for sure. It's always difficult, but is this just going to be something that's going to be in the news for a while and then forgotten in a matter of weeks?
Well, it's a really interesting strategy to only strike a few plants, right? I'm not entirely sure why that was, other than perhaps the UAW was thinking this could be a protracted strike, and so they're trying to save on their strike fund or something along those lines. I don't know how much pressure they're actually putting on the firm by only striking a few plants, right? Because if you allow the firm then to shift some of their production of inputs to other plants, and you're still able to maintain production. So it's a curious strategy on the part of the union. I would have thought they would have just struck all of them. Or the more traditional one, you strike one firm, and of course they're losing sales to their competition, and you have that much more leverage. I can't say I haven't sat in on the strategies on the part of the union, but this seems like an odd choice.
Well, we're going to lose a doc here. We're coming up on the top of the hour. He's great for joining us here on Podcast by George to, put a little light, shed a little light on these issues. Folks, we're talking to Dr. Peter Orazem. Now, he's an Iowa State University economics professor par excellence, recently retired. He's also the director of the program for the study of Midwest markets and entrepreneurship. He's also a funny guy. And economics can be funny. Now, he doesn't know this. I didn't tell him that I was going to show this, but I'm going to do this just because I can. Watch this film clip, folks. I mean, I love this. Now, I found this on the YouTube. Doc, things live forever on the internet. This is great. Watch this.
So a lot of people worried about the economy. It used to be we were worried about high gas prices. We call those the good old days. I liked high gas prices. I mean, you could fill up your tank and double the value of your car. The governor is thinking about changing the state motto. Every 4 or 5 years, we change the state motto in Iowa. The idea being that if we can come up with the right motto, tourists will come. The fundamental flaw in this theory, no one vacations in Iowa on purpose. 60% of the tourists in Iowa had car trouble on their way to Colorado. You want more tourists in Iowa, get more people from Illinois to drive to Colorado.
There's a little humor from the heartland, folks. I mean, we've been talking about very serious issues that impact people very severely, but I mean, you got to have a little bit of fun, and that's my fun, Doc. That's really funny. And the ironic part of it is, here in Iowa, we just changed the state logo. Again, I can't even tell you what it is, but I mean, as you mentioned, we do that every 4 or 5 years. That's great.
Yeah, well, we got to, sell license plates, maybe. I don't know, but just so you know, I am the teaching assistant for our honors class in stand-up comedy, and they're going to let me do that again in the spring. I work with Gavin Jerome, who was a touring comedian and a really funny guy from Ankeny, who comes up and helps. And if people are interested, we've been able to simulcast their final exam, which is at the maintenance shop here on campus.
Well, that's top shelf. I mean, people have told me I'm a funny guy, but those are good jokes. I mean, I got a feeling that that's original stuff. You got nothing if you don't have jokes, and that stuff's funny, Doc. So good on you. That's great.
Well, it's a fun hobby. I've done that for many years.
That's great. Well, I'll give you the last word here. We've got just a minute or two. Anything in closing here out of everything that we've discussed today that you'd kind of like to wrap up with here as we close this live line?
Well, I do think that this will be a really interesting last quarter of this year. We're going to find out if the Fed's recent success in trying to fight inflation works, and so they won't have to continue to increase interest rates. And I think that's going to be extremely important for finding out whether or not we're going to have, what people are hoping for, a soft landing or a recession going into 2024. And I do think that one of the things that is constantly hanging over our economy is the fact that we still have almost 3 million unfilled vacancies a month. And so it's a very strong labor market for people who are looking for work, but it's a very concerning labor market for people who are trying to hire labor and can't find them. And that's serving as an impediment to economic growth for the United States. And that's something we have to fix. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to fill all that labor demand. And I hope we can figure that out pretty soon.
Yeah, I do too. Let's figure it out, folks. Let's have that soft landing that he's talking about, and let's spread it out. Let's make it a soft landing for everybody. Dr. Peter F. Orazem, thanks for coming on this Podcast by George Live Line. Really appreciate it, Doc.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on. Thanks.
Yeah, folks, and I'll tell you, just like I always do here at the close, if you like Podcast by George, if you like this kind of information and insight, And we got a lot of it here today. If you like guests like Dr. Orazem, please subscribe to Podcast by George. You can do that easily. Just go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up there for these video live streams on Facebook and YouTube by clicking the icons for those platforms, or the audio only versions, which are on iTunes and Spotify, the iHeartRadio app, and places like that. It's all at podcastbygeorge.com. Folks, that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.